Everybody, Professor Moore here. So recently I've been posting a lot of videos about one of the most upsetting and violent parts of American history, which is the lynching of Black Americans by white mobs. And I've talked about the origins of the word lynching, the statistics we have on how many Black Americans were lynched, and most recently I talked about who were the lynchers. Now I want to talk about one of the most difficult parts of this topic, which is that lynchings were not about the killing of an individual. Lynchings were about terrorizing the entire Black community. And the main form that this terrorism took was by burning Black Americans alive at the stake. Now, I definitely want to provide a trigger warning because what I'm about to discuss is extremely violent and can be traumatizing. And believe me, I know how hard it is to hear this information. After I gave my first lecture on lynching, when everyone left the room, I collapsed and just started bawling my eyes out. I had no idea how much this information had impacted me. However, I strongly believe that these are the type of stories that we have to keep telling and we have to remember because there's people that are actively trying to erase this history. So before I started researching lynchings, I had this idea that lynchings were just public hangings. I had no idea that Black Americans were being burned alive at the stake. This is something in my mind that I associated with hundreds of years ago and things like the Spanish Inquisition and the witch trials. However, then I came across this NAACP flyer from 1922, which reads, "The shame of America. Do you know that the United States is the only land on earth where human beings are burned at the stake?" They go on to mention that from 1918 to 1921, 28 Black Americans were publicly burned by white mobs. I really couldn't believe what I was reading, but as I did more research, what I found is that lynchings involved public burnings as often as they did public hangings. And often when an individual was hung, they were then cut down and then burned, sometimes for days afterwards. As I did research in historical newspaper databases, I was continually shocked to see how common these stories were. For example, I kept coming across headlines like these: "Burn a Negro at stake in Pennsylvania, tries to escape when burned loose, but is thrust back with pitchforks." "Mob burns Negro at stake. Mob burns captive at stake in Georgia. Negro boy tortured and burned at stake. Eager to burn Negro. Tennessee Negro dies at the stake. 3,000 will burn Negro. Negro is burned to death by mob as scores look on." Burning Black Americans was so common in the United States that Booker T. Washington could make this observation in 1904. "Within the last fortnight, 3 members of my race have been burned at the stake, one of these a woman. In the midst of the nation's busy and prosperous life, few, I fear, take time to consider where these brutal and inhuman practices are leading. The custom of burning human beings has become so common as scarcely to excite interest or attract unusual attention." As I continued to do research, what I found is that the burning of Black Americans had become normalized into American life, and it's something that lasted for decades. Here's a headline from Arkansas in 1892, which reads, "A Negro burned alive, roasted alive in the presence of 1,000 people. The act of an Arkansas mob. Ed Coy protested his innocence. He was recognized by Mrs. Jewell. She applied the torch herself." Here's a headline from 1899, which reads, "Negro dies at the stake, burned by a Georgia mob. His body cut in many pieces." This headline reveals an ugly truth about lynchings, is that they often involve the torture and mutilation of Black bodies. If we look at other reports, we can see that the lynchers often wanted to take body parts from their victims as souvenirs. In 1899, we can read how Sam Hose is lynched. Georgia mob chain and burn Negro at tree, remains cut up as souvenirs. Here's a similar report from 1901, which reads, "Toes taken from fire to keep as souvenirs." Another important fact to remember is that it was not only Black men that were being lynched. Black women and children were also lynched. For example, in 1900, a Colorado mob burned a Black 16-year-old named Preston Porter. As we move further into the 20th century, we can see that these public burnings did not stop, they increased. Here are two headlines from 1905, with one describing how a black man was made into a living torch. Sometimes these spectacles of violence involve the killings of several people, such as this 1906 headline which reads, "Mob burns 3 Negroes at stake." In 1908, we can read this headline about how a black man named Ted Smith was burned in the public square in Greenville, Texas. During the lynching, there were professional photographers taking photographs that would later be turned into postcards, and you can see here they're taking a picture of the bonfire before the individual is publicly burned. A few years after the killing of Ted Smith, we find another public burning in Texas. This 1912 headline reads, 2,000 see a man burned, lynching Negro at Tyler, Texas. The following year, another burning took place in Arkansas, and we can see the paper describing how mob hangs and burns, Negro put to death in street at Hot Springs, Arkansas, tourist horror-stricken. In 1918, a photographer snapped a photo of a group of lynchers that had just burned a black man alive, and you can see that they labeled this photograph the Omaha Lynching Party. Even into the 1920s, we can continue to see these public burnings taking place. In 1922, we can read about how boy 15 tortured over slow fire, crying victim then dragged into road, flame rekindled at stake, burning body made target for bullets. Mob now seeks another to be lynched. I think the most important fact to remember about these public burnings of black Americans is that they were attended by thousands of people. This is something that the white community wanted to see. As we can see from this drawing that was done that the artist labeled her first lynching. We can see a mother holding up her daughter in order to get a better view of a black man being burned alive. Like I've mentioned before, lynching was not done by individuals. It took a community and a culture to commit these acts of violence. This is the exact point that a preacher made in 1917 after a black man named L. Persons was lynched in Tennessee. The day after the killing, the preacher said, "We burned a Negro at the stake yesterday. Let us underscore the word we. So if we are proud of it, let us be proud of it together. If we are ashamed of it, let us be ashamed of it together. Let's not be cowardly enough to put it off onto someone else, claiming that we were at home attending to business. Public opinion burned L. Persons, the minister of the gospel, the lawyer, the doctor, the newspaper editor, the man who talks to others on the street corner or the streetcar. He shared in it. That is, he did unless he protested. And there were few protests. The majority approved. The minority kept silent. And silence gives consent." I firmly believe that if historians don't tell these stories and give an accurate representation of the American past, that silence is consent to the continuation of white supremacy and racism. These stories have to continue to be told because silence gives consent.